Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you the final of this series of 50mm reviews that I've kind of broken out from after doing some direct head-to-head comparisons. But I also wanted to present individualized reviews of these lenses because they all kind of stand on their own merits and are worth consideration there. And so today we're looking at the least expensive of the trio. This is the only non-Sony lens that's been a part of this comparison, and it is a Samyang autofocusing 50mm f1.4 lens. And so, as noted, this is the least expensive of the trio. In fact, it comes in, right now the retail in the US market is $599. I've heard some people say that on different promotions they've been able to see it at even right around the $500 price point. And so it's hard to argue against the value on a lot of levels for this lens, and I'll detail some of those reasons why. First of all, we're going to take a look at just a few of the details of the build quality here. And if you would like more information on that, a closer look at it, I would encourage you that you look at the build and handling episode, which you can see here. Now, first thing to note is that this is actually a beautifully constructed lens, and Samyang lenses have come a long way from when I first started to review them, where they were kind of bargain optics in, you know, kind of cheapish type shells. This is definitely a premium filling lens. It's got lots of metal in the construction. I mean, everything really looks as good, you know, particularly compared to the Sonnar 55mm f1.8. I don't see anything about the Samyang that is inferior to that lens in design. From the quality of the materials, to the feel of everything, to the handling of the lens. It's all really rather premium here, and this is it's a great looking lens, and it handles nicely. The one kind of thing that I will note is that the manual focus ring, and all three of these lenses are focused by wire, which means that the input from the focus ring is input through the focus motor, and thus focus begins to move after that. And so in that focus kind of refining process, when you begin to turn the ring, of course, you have to be in the correct mode for this to happen. And so right now I've got it in DMF mode, direct manual focus. And so as a result, then you can begin to refine focus once you turn the ring. Just note that the ring action is a little bit lighter than the other two, particularly when compared to the 50mm planar. And so as a result, I just find that maybe there's a little less refinement in that focus. It's a little bit light to my touch, but certainly very usable in that sense. No major issues there. We'll talk a little bit more about the autofocus in just a moment. Let's just continue looking here at the build for a second though. Like the Sonnar lens, but unlike the Planar lens, this lens has no weather sealing. And so if that is a priority for you, just note that this lens is not sealed neither at the gasket nor in any kind of internal seals. It terminates in a 67mm front filter thread, which is in metal. Very nice there. This lens kind of takes the medium path in terms of size and weight. It weighs in at a moderate 585 grams. That's just a little over 1¼ pounds. And it's under 4 inches long, 3.85 inches, or 97.7 millimeters. So certainly on an A7R Mark III that I'm doing the primary review on, it's a a moderately sized but nicely balanced lens here that's not stressing anything. And so I don't think that should be anybody that has any serious complaints about that. Included pedal-shaped lens hood is plastic, as are the other two, and it doesn't feel, particularly amazing, but in some ways it actually feels a hair more premium than does both of the Sony lens hoods, in that the construction materials, the plastics here, are just a little bit thicker and heavy duty. It clicks into place nice and precisely, no issues there. Now, there are no switches on the Samyang, and so if you're going to switch into manual focus, for example, you're going to have to do that in camera or shoot in DMF mode to allow you to manual override at any point. And so no switches there for anything. And there is no optical steady shot built into the lens, and so you're going to have to rely on the in-camera steady shot, assuming that you're shooting with a camera that offers that feature. But if you are, as it's both the A6500 that I've done a review on and the A7R Mark III, of course there's no issues with that. It will automatically detect the actual steady shot. It will actually detect the focal length here, and it will automatically adjust for it. And so no issues when it comes to that. Now, moving on to looking at the autofocus. Of course, Samyang traditionally has been a manual focus only company. And really, it's these early lenses, a 14mm and a 50mm for Sony FE, that were their very first autofocusing lenses. And since that point, they have wet their feet a little bit further with more Sony-based AF lenses, and then also their first Canon EF mount autofocusing lens that's just coming to market at the time of this review. So, byproduct, of course, of that is that they are not seasoned professionals at producing autofocus systems. And in some ways, the somewhat primitive stage of development shows up in this lens, in that when compared to the other two, it's definitely the most primitive autofocus system, both in the noises that it makes, which tend to be quite loud, with kind of a somewhat scratchy sound, but also kind of a little bit of a high-pitched whirring that's taking place. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of the noises made by, kind of earlier generation lenses with micro motors, where they were just kind of buzzy sounding. And so as a result, all aspects of autofocus, are kind of magnified by that. So for example, if I am manually focusing, the lens is constantly making noises that kind of reminds me of things going on, almost like it's struggling to keep up, which I don't think is actually the case. It's just that it's loud. And so that shows up. Obviously, for video, this is the worst choice by a wide margin of the three lenses for video capture, for a couple of reasons. Number one, with all three of these lenses, I have shot one of these video segments like I'm doing right now. With the two Sony lenses, the face tracking was essentially perfect, and they're both quiet enough that while I don't use on-camera audio, particularly with the Sonnar lens, I would have no hesitation about doing so. It is perfectly quiet, and the Planar makes some very quiet sounds, but it certainly would be fine for that application as well. The Samyang makes enough noise pretty much constantly that's going to be picked up by on-camera microphones. And beyond that, it also was it was not particularly confident in face tracking. It would do a fair bit of hunting, it would lose face, kind of go in and out of focus some. As a part of this series, including the Sony FE 50mm f1.4, and this is the Planar design with some. And so the autofocus system is it's just not as good. And so similarly, when you're shooting in stills mode, IAF doesn't work quite as well as it does with the native Sony lenses, probably as you might expect. But and at the same time, focus, there's a little bit more hunting. It takes a little bit longer to acquire focus. At the end of the day, I think the focus system works. For stills photography, it gets the job done. And my focus consistency, while not quite at the level of the Sony lenses, in an absolute sense has not been bad. And so I think that, and you can shoot portraits with IAF and you can get nice results. But this just note that this is the least sophisticated focus system of the three. Now, there is a firmware update, and I can't verify whether or not the lens copy I have has it or not, because there's a dock for Samyang lenses now for applying firmware updates that I don't have yet at this point, as this is the very first autofocus lens from them that I've had, anything that would require something like this. And so, but at the same time, you have to understand the limitations of firmware. Firmware, I think, can improve the focus algorithms and get a little bit smoother results of the autofocus, but it can't change the sounds that the autofocus system makes. It can't change the fundamental nature of that focus system. And so, but at the same time, if you do purchase this lens, or if you have purchased this lens, you might want to look into getting that dock and applying that firmware update, because it may improve your absolute performance. And again, I can't verify at this moment whether or not this lens has that firmware update or if it doesn't. It's obviously, it's a brand new lens, only a few weeks old. I got it, retail copy for this review from B&H Photo, and so, maybe it has it, maybe it doesn't. I can't say for certain, but it's worth looking into if you're considering this lens. Now, moving on to the image quality results. First, looking at it on APS-C, I tested it on a Sony a6500 24 megapixel camera. And in those results, I found that of the three lenses, it was the least sharp. It suffers with some chromatic aberrations, axial or longitudinal chromatic aberrations, and so that exhibits as green fringing after the plane of focus and purple fringing before the plane of focus. And unfortunately, it shows fairly pronounced amounts of both. Purple fringing, kind of trending to more almost like a red type color. And so the byproduct of that is that wide open contrast and contrast at wide apertures is quite reduced. And so it has a softer, you can call it a dreamy type look, if you're kind of looking at it in a critically sharp kind of way. The corners at wide apertures are quite soft. Center sharpness is not bad, center contrast is low, but edge sharpness is also quite weak. And the same bears true. There is some improvement at f2, some improvement at f2.8. It's really, though, in the jump between f2.8 and f4 that the aberrations are eliminated and contrast takes a jump forward. And then by about f5.6, really the resolution performance across the frame is fairly similar to that of the Sony lenses. For someone like myself, however, I primarily shoot these wide aperture lenses at wide apertures. It's kind of the point. And so if your priority is resolution, there are better options for you out there. Now, taking a look at it on full frame, and you could take a look at this episode here where I covered that, but just note that my end results were really quite similar on either APS-C or on full frame. And so what I've detailed in terms of resolution remains true for that. However, one thing that I do want to point out as kind of a defense of this lens is that when you look kind of beyond the, the lower contrast and lower resolution, and you look at kind of the complete rendering from the lens, the rendering from the lens in a lot of situations is actually quite beautiful, and it has the softest bokeh quality of the three lenses, even more so than the very, very expensive, 2.5 times, nearly 3 times more expensive Planar f1.4 from Sony Zeiss. And so bokeh quality is very, very soft. And so really, if you are someone that's more about kind of artistic rendering and maybe even shooting portraiture where you value, you don't really want a lot of micro contrast on pores and skin, you would prefer just kind of a look of lenses or images where it has a very soft, very pleasing out of focus background. This lens, I think, does have a lot of artistic merit because it does have the most beautiful bokeh of the bunch in a noticeable way. I noted that even though it shares the same theoretical maximum aperture with the Sony Planar, the light transmission on the Samyang is clearly the best of the bunch. And I had to use lower shutter speeds to get comparative exposure with the Planar lens to match up with the Samyang. Beyond that, I also noted that even at the exact same distance, exact same aperture, and while the subject magnification was the same, so it's not about focal length, but I noticed that in defocused areas that bokeh circles, for example, were larger and softer, noticeably so, which tells me that this lens actually has a larger maximum aperture. It has better light transmission than what the Sony Zeiss Planar does. And again, recognize that all of these things, be it focal length or aperture value, etc., they're always it's not an exact science, and that there's rounding up or rounding down. And so I think in this case, you're actually getting a great T-stop rating with the Samyang lens. It has great light transmission, and as a byproduct of that, it also produces the softest, nicest out of focus rendering. And so this really comes down to a different strokes for different folks kind of people. If you're all about contrast and resolution, this is not the lens for you. But if you're into kind of beautifully rendered portraits where it's not so much about pixel peeping, more about the general feel of the images, in some ways it's akin to a lens like, say, Canon's 50mm f1.2 L series lens, in that it's not fantastically sharp or has fantastic contrast at wide apertures, but it has beautiful rendering. Now, one final thing that I will note about this lens is that it does trend towards a warmer rendering. The Planar lens kind of produces the most neutral, kind of Zeiss-like color rendition. The Sonnar lens, 55mm f1.8, it trends a little bit cooler. The Samyang trends a little bit warmer, even a little bit maybe slightly yellowish shift. I find, compared to the other lenses, you know, all other settings being equalized. And so I find that that's either a good thing or a bad thing depending on the subject matter. When shooting landscapes, I found that it almost provided a little bit of a filter type look that I wasn't crazy about. But in shooting portraits or shooting kind of artful, you know, wide aperture kind of shots, it can actually be a benefit, is that it gives a slightly kind of analog, warmer feel that kind of reminds me of some of my vintage glass, that, you know, sometimes some of the elements become very slightly yellowed, and so there's just a little slight bias of yellow in there. And so for some subjects, it produces a really beautiful, warm result that you may like. Just note that that's a taste-specific thing, but it's certainly a character of this lens that I did want to point out. Now, if you will look in the description down below, number one, I will have linkage to the full written review for this, also an image gallery where you can go and look at photos from it. And then also there, of course, there's buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. And also, if you will look, I will try to pin into the top of, I'm filming this video in advance, okay? And so the contest for the lens cases has not yet fully run its course. And so if you're wanting to get into that giveaway, it should be wrapping up somewhere about the time I am releasing this video. And so I'm not going to be announced the winner, but what I will do is, if you'll look in the comment section down below, I'll pin to the top of the comments the announcement of the winner, and then of course I'll also notify them via email if those that won the actual competition there. And so I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you haven't already, you can follow me on social media and links down below, sign up for my newsletter, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.